This lesson is going to be about how to use Gagne's instructional events as a way to create effective lessons. Robert Gagne was an instructional designer who started out teaching soldiers in World War II. Instructional design at that point was very much from what we call a behaviorist perspective, that it was just in terms of behaviors, and learning was just a matter of providing the correct response to a given stimulus. Gagne was one of the first ones to come up with the idea that, well, wait a minute, there's more to learning than that there's something that goes on in the mind or in the brain that affects learning. And he came up with what he calls his instructional events, a procedure by which teachers can help facilitate that learning process in students. Before we get started, I want you to think about these questions. How do you define learning? How do you know your students have learned something? What's the first step in learning something new? What do students have to do? What do teachers have to do in order to be ready to learn something? And what is effective teaching? Think about a teacher that you've had that you thought was particularly effective, and what did that teacher do that was so effective? Now, my perspective on learning is very much a cognitivist perspective, that it is all based on memory. And learning is simply getting something into what we call long-term memory in such a way that you can get it back out again when you need to use it. I'm going to present a graphic to you that describes this learning process in terms of memory. And I want you to see if you can figure out what the first step in the learning process is from a cognitivist perspective. Are you paying attention? That's right. From a cognitivist perspective, first step in learning is paying attention. In terms of memory, learning is a process of taking information that's coming in from all of your senses and paying attention to the important part. When you pay attention to it, it moves into short-term memory or working memory. That's our conscious memory, what we actually are thinking about at the time. Then you have to encode it in such a way that it gets into long-term memory, but it has to be encoded in a way that you can retrieve it later on, because in order to use that information, you have to be able to retrieve it into short-term memory, again, working memory, which is where we are actually consciously aware of information, or consciously aware of what we know, and where we're using that to solve problems, follow procedures, follow rules, understand things. If you don't pay attention to something, it drops out of the sensory register. And how fast does it drop out? Like that. That was a finger snap. It's literally half a second. The sensory register holds a lot of information, but it does it for only half a second. If you don't pay attention to it within a half a second, it goes bye-bye. Short-term memory, you can hold information longer. It's about 30 seconds, but you can only hold a small amount of information. It's generally 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. Yes, that's why our phone numbers are 7 digits long. If you don't repeat it, if you don't rehearse it, if you don't try to organize it in a way that you can put more information in there in such a way that you can then encode it into long-term memory, it goes bye-bye. Once you encode it into long-term memory, that's not enough. You have to encode it in a meaningful way, in an organized way, in what we call a deep processing way, in order to be able to retrieve it later on. If you don't do that, it goes bye-bye. So there are all these places here where students can forget what it is they're supposed to be learning. One of the things that we have to do as teachers is try to help them go through this memory process in order to get information into long-term memory in a way that they can get it back out later on. What I want you to be able to do at the end of this lesson is use Gagne's instructional events to teach a 5-minute lesson. When you come to the training session, I want you to actually teach that lesson, and then we're going to evaluate how well you applied Gagne's instructional events. So let's think about this. You've been a teacher, you've been a student. I want you to think about a lesson that you've taught, a class that you've taught, a topic that you've taught where everything seemed to click with your students, where they got it, where they were engaged, where they understood what they were supposed to learn, where they were able to apply it later on. Think about the lessons that you yourself have learned where things seemed to click, where things made sense, where you understood exactly what you were supposed to learn. The teacher did things in a logical way. You understood everything that he or she was saying. And then think about, what did these experiences have in common?